Thank you so much, Leah, for joining me today for this Life Stories conversation. I'd really love to hear about your role here in the theater, introduce yourself, talk about your work, your research, and
So I'm Leah Tidey, and I'm a PhD candidate in applied theater here at UVic. And I've actually been at the University of Victoria now for 7 years.
Wow, that's impressive.
Right? Is it at a certain point? It's like, oh wow, like she's still here. But I was fortunate that when I first came to UVic in 2012, I found out what applied theater was because I had no idea until I came here.
I'd never heard of it until I came here.
Yeah, and UVic is one of the only universities in Canada that actually offers applied theater as its coursework, and especially at a high level for a PhD, one of the only in the country. I've, as I said, been here for 7 years because I found applied theater, which is using, it's more like less conventional theater. So we use theater for social justice and community building and education. Work a lot of time with people who aren't necessarily trained in theater, but who have a voice, who want to share their stories. And so when I arrived here and found that out, I was like, that's what I need to do with my life. Like this is it.
Really important, so innovative.
Yeah, anyway, so that's 7 years and counting. So started my BFA here and have just gone right through and hopefully finish my PhD in the next year.
Oh, impressive.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so tell me a bit about some of the projects you've been able to work on while you're here.
Yeah. Well, kind of the first major thing for me coming to UVic and thinking about theater, but also thinking about intergenerational theater and working with people of different ages is in the third year of my undergrad, I was offered an opportunity to go to Tamil Nadu, India, and live in an elders village. And
what an experience.
It was just amazing. And spending, 3.5 months living in this elders village. It was a part of a PhD project, and there were 13 of us there. And so we worked with the elders and with a whole bunch of different local community groups and schools with all of the students. So it was my first real experience of bringing people of different ages together and just seeing that incredible playfulness and joy and that storytelling that happens when you bring people of different ages together.
Yeah, that sounds like a life-changing experience.
It was now almost 5 years ago, which seems crazy, but even, as I'm writing my dissertation and thinking about my own practice and research now, like I keep learning new things and it keeps informing my work. And I think a lot of that, especially that playfulness aspect has come up for me. And I think my research, working with older adults and youth about sexuality across the life course, I think playfulness and humor is key because you don't want to walk into a room of strangers and say, all right, everyone, let's talk about sex. And you don't know me, I don't know you. This person's 70, this person's 16. And so that's been really huge in my own practice.
Yeah, and I think what really drew me to your work is this intergenerational component because I feel today in society we tend to silo the generations, and there's a real shaping force in the media, the way we're raised and educated to kind of silo and kind of not facilitate cross-generational conversations.
Absolutely.
So when thinking about our exhibition and life stories in your work, I'd really love to hear more about the insights that you've gained from your intergenerational practice.
So a big part of that has been community building and realizing how long that takes to get people to trust you with their stories, especially with their life stories, and really honoring them. And when people do share them with you, how do you honor them and use them creatively and in a way that's not exploitative, but actually really celebrating the fact that they've shared that.
Well, that sounds very tricky.
Yeah, especially when there's stories about sex. It can be. It's a bit of a fine art. But what's been really nice, so I worked with the Victoria Target Theatre Society, which is a seniors-based theatre company where it's all older adults and they create theatre with, by, and for older adults.
What a great concept.
They're amazing. I think they're one of the
I'd never heard of them before your work.
It's kind of interesting because they work in smaller community groups, and so it's not necessarily larger public performances, but they are doing applied theater work, and a lot of the time they haven't necessarily called it that, but they're being like, there are a lot of topics that, are facing older adults, and we're older adults ourselves, we're the best ones to tell these stories. So I was very honored when I was talking to one of their board members, and she was like, you should write a grant and do some intergenerational work with them. I was like, really? Do you think they'd be willing to? We're going to hang out with teenagers, we're going to talk about sex, I'm going to make them create a play about it. And they're like, oh yeah, they'll be into it. So yeah, that's kind of what started this partnership. So Target Theater, and then we worked at Victoria High School. We met there once a week for about 4 months, and from that, those insights about life stories and that intergenerational connection, and how it's not necessarily a linear thing. It's how the stories that you hear from older adults about their own youth, and then the youth considering how that's going to affect their life now and over the years, has been amazing. So those first few months was really key about creating that safe environment of saying, we're going to bring in film, we're going to bring in music and newspaper articles and all these different things, so we can talk about sexuality and talk about what that means at any age, but without getting too personal. Because knowing that, with my own training, I'm not, a trained psychologist or anything.
It's not group therapy.
And it's not drama therapy, and it's like, I know my own limits of being like, of course, if there's something you want to share with me that can be quite intimate or quite sensitive, I'll know who to talk to about it. But in a whole group setting, it's how do we look at stories a bit outside of ourselves? And when you start talking about a newspaper article about consent or about asexuality, people's own opinions, they're like, oh, well, I think this character might deal with it this way. Their own stories are influencing their input anyway. So you're gaining insight while still creating some safe distance.
Yeah, and you are creating characters. It's for a dramatic performance. Ultimately.
And it's been kind of amazing. It actually started with one of the older adult collaborators I was working with. She shared the story with me about one of her dear friends, and how she had been with her husband for many, many years, and then quite suddenly, when they were in their late 60s, he passed away. And she just didn't know what to do, and her life was kind of turned upside down. And then about a year or so later, she goes to this dinner party, and she ends up having fun with her friends, and she's like laughing for the first time in months, and has a glass of wine, and then there's a mutual acquaintance there, and one thing leads to another. She ends up going home with this man, having a one-night stand, and the next morning tells her friend that she felt just like a teenager. And those are her precise words. I was like, that's dramatic gold. I was like, what happens if she's had this one-night stand, and then her granddaughter comes over and is like, whoa, hold on, what's happened here? And so it was great, because we use this story based on a real story and lived experience. And I was like, oh, interesting. Let's, for the sake of our purposes, we'll call this character Grace, and we'll call this one Jenna, and what's happening here? And so we kind of tease it out from there, and the amount of stories in terms of figuring out your sexual orientation, and talking about gender, and talking about all these different things, and how that's really changed, I think, especially over the last 50, 60 years, in terms of how we talk about these things in society, was amazing. Watching that discussion between the two ages, and just, I think it really opened their eyes to, I think, reflecting on their own experiences when they were youth. I think one of the main things that was amazing was talking about, again, gender identity and orientation. And one of the students was explaining to one of the older adult collaborators, there's at least a 50-year difference between the two of them, and the student is explaining that they're pansexual, and that their pronouns are they, and what that means for them. And this older adult collaborator being like, that just wasn't even an option when I was young. It's like, that was a thing? He was like, that sounds amazing. Like, okay, like, sure. Like, pansexual sounds so much more freeing. Like, what? And so it was interesting how that's kind of those stories and insights that I think I think so often when we talk about aging, we say, that you've developed who you are, then you just,
Yeah.
you stay the same, and you just happen to
Exactly.
be in an aging body. But really, like, there's so many things that,
Yeah.
that change throughout your life.
And I think
Yeah.
it's that the transformative potential of your work to allow people to be liberated, in a sense, from feeling that they have to follow a kind of lockstep progression, and thinking about the societal perceptions about what's appropriate at a certain age,
Absolutely.
and then feeling guilty if one doesn't somehow live up to those, or if one transgresses them, or
Yeah.
and so your work has potential to really liberate people from these perceptions.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, in terms of like liberating. Because a lot of time, I will talk about advocacy, and hopefully it comes from, you've been able to be in a room together and be quite open and honest and vulnerable with each other, and then how do you take that new sense of community, but also being like, oh yeah, I can talk knowledgeably about sexual health, or I can talk to someone whose gender identity, maybe at the beginning of this project, I didn't really understand, but now I'm like, oh, like, this is just a person. And of course, we know that, but intellectually, but to actually feel that and have a connection with someone has been kind of amazing. And so when we think about advocacy, is how do you be involved in this project, which, as it is with research, it's normally within these certain parameters. But then what happens? What's happening leading into it, and what's happening afterwards? And I hope that it's carrying that idea forward of being like, did you know I was in a play and we sang about condom use? Like, hilarious. So hopefully you just have that conversation at Thanksgiving dinner or something, right? And definitely a lot of my collaborators have. They'll be walking down the street singing certain things. People are like, what's that from? They're like, oh, it's this sex play that I'm in. Like, it's just been hysterical. And I think people also do it because they like the shock value.
Yeah, and we need that. We need that shock.
To shake you out of that way of thinking.
Right.
Of being like, oh, it absolutely is supposed to be this way, and
exactly. And we're hoping our exhibition does a little bit of that, kind of shaking up, or getting people to stop and think, oh yeah, it doesn't have to be like this, or that really reminds me of what happened when I was doing whatever, as part of their own life stories.
Well, and I think with life stories, and what I find so amazing about it is that instantly when we think about like life course, people automatically associate with aging, and you don't think of life courses, it's happening to all of us, and then our life stories are things that influence that. And really, like, ageism itself is one of the last isms that's so ingrained in our language.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the really interesting thing about it, is that there's so much of this emphasis on youthfulness and vitality and whatever we associate with that, and instead of how do we look at vitality at any age, and what does that mean? And the stories that we tell about ourselves are some of the most important aspect of that. That internalized, is it internalized shame, or is it really empowering to be like, oh yeah, like at any point in my life, like people are made up of stories, and it's the stories that I choose to tell about myself.
Exactly, I can change the narrative. And I was really struck at one point when you noted in a previous conversation about how aging is the other that we all become. And I thought that was a very powerful thought. I'd love to hear more about your recent work with Island Sexual Health.
Absolutely. So I was encouraged to apply for Island Health every year as a community wellness grant. They have multiple different grants. And so a lot of the collaborators I was working with, they were like, well, we want to see this project continue more. We created this 25-minute play and this follow-up workshop, and they're like, there's so much more to cover as it is. I mean, it's a huge, huge topic. And so I was very fortunate to partner with Island Sexual Health. And so over the last year, working primarily with older adults to create a program that suits their self-identified needs. Because we have more and more older adults coming to the sexual health clinic being like, where are the resources specifically for me? Because so much of it is tailored to youth.
Exactly.
And a lot of that built on that ageist and social stigma. And so, being able to, and for healthcare providers and older adults to talk knowledgeably about it and to know how to access those resources So it's been really wonderful to kind of do these conversations and these focus groups about, okay, what do you want in the script? And so then I spent the summer turning this 25-minute play into a 55-minute play and trying to tease out these really important aspects that people wanted to talk about. And so now we're doing a staged play reading. So still not quite a full-blown performance. All of our actors will have scripts in hand, but they go through the whole play, and it's to work with our audiences of various older adult community groups around Victoria.
Nice.
To say, this is a resource we're creating for you. So we don't want to create this fully polished project, because this is a collaborative piece. This is, what do you want? What are we missing? And how can we address the needs that you want to be addressed? But be able to talk about it through these characters still. So you don't necessarily want to have a group of people who are like, well, we need more conversations about sexually transmitted infections, and maybe they've outed themselves and they'll feel uncomfortable, right? Understandably, to say to a group of room, I have chlamydia, even though I make my actor do that. But he's very good-natured about it. But yeah, like it's how do we present this performance, and it's a comedy. Again, that's a lot of my work is using that humor.
It's so important,
right? And it's just hysterical.
It's so important.
Right? And we spend so
I
much
myself am a mother of a young adult, and I find humor works
right.
all the time.
These tough life conversations.
It's like
right?
the best tool out there.
Yeah, well, and if you're taking it so seriously, it's hard to look at all of these other things that are influencing it.
It just terrifies people when you do that.
Oh, I know. Yeah. And so I didn't want to come in and start like lecturing to people, especially people who are much older than myself. They're like, who are you? Why is she coming in? Like, you're not even 30 and you're coming in being like, did you know for people that are 70? So they're like, don't have the lived experience. Like, who is this chick, basically? But so yeah, it's been, actually that's going up next week, our performances, and then afterwards having this workshop so that we can replay certain moments from the play itself and say, did this seem realistic? Like, did this conversation, at one point it's negotiating consent between two characters, and there's a lot of language that goes into that, like body language and what do we verbally say and how do we look
tricky territory.
Yeah, and it is. And so we're looking at the framing in terms of enthusiastic agreement, and how do we, if we think about it in terms of enthusiastic agreement, how can we have a more wholesome discussion? And again, such different working with youth and with older adults, and the youth, like, they are steeped in this language. And a lot of older adults, I mean, they were lucky if they got any sexual health education at school or any conversations at home. Normally, and most people I've talked to, it's very minimal. And so it can be a totally new territory, right? And so it's just been fascinating, and that's what I'm hoping, that we can recreate these moments, and some of them really quite intense with talking about consent, but again, doing it in a way that's not going to be like triggering for anyone, but having that tough conversation. But we're looking at characters who are experiencing this.
Perfect.
But then we're also looking at, this couple, they meet each other at a party. It's like the meet cute in a movie, like they meet each other and some sort of romantic thing is going to happen between them. And what does that conversation look like? Like, what does it actually look like to flirt with someone? And if you're, one of the characters has been divorced for a few years, the other one's lost their partner. So they're coming up on 70 and they're at a party and they're like, so... you come here often? Like, it's just playing with that. Yeah. But it's been really amazing to see how there's a real commitment to the sustainability of the project, because we want to have more and more voices involved in it. Because the only thing that we really know in terms of life stories and in terms of sexuality is that the only normal thing is variety. That's all.
Yeah.
And so trying
I like that.
Yeah, and I can't claim that for myself. That was definitely Dan Savage, the Savage Love Cast. He's like, variety is the norm. That's the only norm. And has been really helpful of framing that. And I think, especially when I, bringing in new collaborators who are 17, 18 years old and in their 60s or 70s, being like, just so you know, like, if you feel uncomfortable, if you don't want to share a personal story, know that whatever your experience, somebody else has probably experienced it, but also you're your own person. There's so many things out there that that's kind of the beauty of it, is that's what makes us humans. We're all combined of these stories, and how do we start weaving them together to see our connections. And I think especially in such a divided world right now, it's more and more how do you find that human connection, regardless of age, regardless of sexual orientation, of so many other different things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You know, that's the normal variety. I always say that to myself all the time as I confront situations that I've never confronted before. With my younger son, I have two boys. It's like, I've never dealt with this before, but I'm sure somebody's
right. Somebody has.
Somewhere.
Right.
It's like so outside of my realm of experience.
Right. I can imagine.
I just have to laugh. I could just. Okay.
Yeah, you're like, this is the situation we're in. Okay. Right? Yeah, a big part of why a lot of my work isn't with people who are related to each other, because I'm like, there's a whole other can of worms, and so we're just gonna remove that one little emotional piece so that, you know, we're not, you know, we can play, you know, like grandparents and grandchildren, and maybe that'll spark a conversation with your own.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
But that moment is pretty it's hard to put together. I know people at first like, oh, I don't want to talk to my grandpa about this. I'm not asking you to, that's fine. But you're talking to someone who is close to your grandfather's age. That's pretty great.
Yeah. And it's funny you're talking, talking about dating. I mean, I've been married for, 35 or, years. But I always think, gee, what if something happened and I had to go back out there?
Right? It's
frightening.
It is. When
I don't know what to
so much.
I certainly wouldn't get onto some of these dating apps and
right?
like,
and it's, you know, a lot of it's not super user friendly as well. It can be pretty dehumanizing.
And yet a lot of adults my age are back dating because of divorce.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's such a huge rate of divorce these days.
Yeah.
Half my friends are divorced and out with new partners are looking.
Yeah. Well, and that's a big part of why like STIs are becoming more and more an issue again.
They're big.
Right?
As I've discovered.
Yeah, right? Especially with, you know, with like heterosexual couples, and, you know, if depending on how old the woman is and she's like, oh, I've already gone through menopause, doesn't matter, you know? And I'm like, well, it's a lot of other things that can happen.
So would you like to talk a little bit more about the intercultural or world-minded dimension of your work? Your work's so much about diversity. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
One thing that I've really tried to be aware of is my own privilege as an academic and a researcher, you know, of knowing that, you know, I'm very privileged to be able to live and work where I do, but being a white settler is how am I aware of the space that I'm taking up, but the space that I'm holding for different voices to emerge. And it's difficult because, of course, you know, I want to have as inclusive a space as possible, because obviously we know in terms of sexuality and sexual expression that happens for, you know, everyone and anyone. That's not based on any sort of, you know, like race or identity or ethnicity. It's across all things. But it is hard, I think, you know, being in Victoria with, you know, like not a huge range of diversity as well, but then also knowing that maybe there are people who wouldn't necessarily trust me with their stories. And that's very fair, because I think so often in Western research we hear the voices of white cisgendered folks so often that it can be very daunting to share voices outside of that. And even for me, it's like, oh, okay, so I'm sharing the voices of youth and older adults, and that's quite innovative. But even in that, predominantly, again, you know, white settler folks. In terms of gender identity, there's definitely been diversity in that, and that's something I'm really, really proud of, because I've tried to hold a safe space for people of various gender identities to feel safe and honored in that space. But knowing that it's really on all of us, especially in terms of reconciliation and working with Indigenous communities across Canada, that, you know, it's not my role to go into a community and say, you know, I'm gonna help you with this. Like, I don't want to recreate this whole colonial narrative. How do we make sure that, you know, we can hold space for these stories, but not impose them on anyone else? And so I would love, as I'm, writing my dissertation right now, I say, this is such a narrow perspective, and we know that there's so many more things that influence our experiences of life, the stories that we tell about ourselves, and it's so difficult when, again, you'd feel like it's silo. It's an age silo, but it's also like, these are the voices that we hear too often, and we need to start holding space for more and more to emerge.
Very good point. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.